You know, it's pretty rare for a movie trilogy to have all three parts be on a fairly equal level of quality. And it's even rarer for that to happen to an animated franchise. I think so far Toy Story is pretty much the only one I can think of that would be like that. With How to Train Your Dragon will most likely be on that list too once its third part inevitably comes out. But for now, surprisingly enough, Kung Fu Panda. I had actually forgotten how solid of movies these were until I recently went back and watched the second one before watching the new one, and I had totally forgotten that these movies are actually really good. And with Kung Fu Panda 3, it's pretty much, like I said, just on the pretty similar level of quality as the others. The humor is on point, the animation is gorgeous to look at, and the action is fast-paced, which is exactly what you want in an animated action movie. And with Kung Fu Panda 3, we get to see a little bit more of the character of Po being developed into something a little more complex than the just clumsy oaf that we all know and love. By the end of this movie, you kind of get a much better idea of the fact that Po is as important as he's been called. I mean, ever since the beginning, he is the Dragon Warrior, but it really is toward the end of this movie that you really get the sense that Po really actually is as important as he's kind of being built up to be. Now, one thing that this franchise does well with the first two movies is have really, really strong villains. They're very well-rounded villains with motives that, yes, are evil, but you can kind of see how a twisted mind like theirs could believe it to be true. Especially with the second one. Gary Oldman, that character in Kung Fu Panda 2 is one of the most interesting and layered villains that you can find in an animated movie like this. I really dig the villains of these movies. Now, while the villain of Kung Fu Panda 3 is certainly better than average for an animated movie villain, I will say that there's just a little something that I kind of have a problem with this time. You see, in general, Kung Fu Panda 3 seems to have a much more lighthearted and comedy-focused than the previous two, especially the second one. I'm not really sure why that is. I guess maybe there were complaints about the second one being a little too dark, maybe? I'm not sure, because this one seems to be almost entirely focused on comedy, and it's a much more lighthearted film than the second one was. And this is especially true with the villain, this time played by J.K. Simmons. Well, the humor of this movie is very good, and I feel like it hits much more often than it ever misses, but the problem with that, I feel like, is that the writers were having a little too much fun writing jokes about the villain and writing jokes for the villain, that they also kind of forgot to make the villain scary. That's one of the things I loved so much about the previous two villains, is that they were certainly given a lot of comedic moments to do. They were given a lot of comedic lines and things like that, but they were also shown to be very intimidating. You really felt the threat of those two villains, even with the villain in the second movie, which physically doesn't look like an intimidating character, but the movie did a great job of establishing him as being very intimidating. But they still gave him some very comedic shticks to do, and which kind of made it much more interesting. This time around, I feel like, again, they were having a little too much fun writing jokes for this guy and jokes about him that they forgot to really make him intimidating at all. And the unfortunate consequence of that is that this villain just does not seem to feel as much of a threat as the other ones do. I mean, a peacock from the second movie feels much more of a threat than this soul-stealing, huge bull guy with Kratos swords. Somehow that character, who should be just, from mere look alone, should be very intimidating, but this movie does so much comedy stuff that it just doesn't he just doesn't feel that much of a threat, really. Oh, they certainly talk about him being a threat, but that's just it. It's just talk. That's the kind of thing you have to do. You have to show, don't tell. This movie tells us that this is an intimidating villain, but there's not a lot of moments where you really get to see him as intimidating as the previous villains. This guy just does a lot more comedy shtick this time around. Now, I don't want to come too hard on this villain, because after all, he is still a much more interesting and much more complex villain than you're gonna get out of your average animated movie. I just feel like, compared to the previous two villains, this one just doesn't seem to be all that much of a threat. In fact, I feel like this is probably the biggest reason why I think Kung Fu Panda 3 is most likely my least favorite of this trilogy. Now, don't take that the wrong way, okay? Just because I say that this is my least favorite of the trilogy, that's more of kind of like because of default, because there's going to be a least favorite of a trilogy, and it just so happens this one is. But that's kind of like me saying Temple of Doom is my least favorite of the Indiana Jones trilogy. Technically that's true, I guess, but really that's only because if given the option of the three, that's the one that I would be the least likely to watch again. And the same with Kung Fu Panda 3. If I was to rewatch any of these movies, I feel like this one, Kung Fu Panda 3, is going to be probably the least likely for me to rewatch again. But that basically just means that Kung Fu Panda 3 is kind of like this. It's really not far behind. I still thoroughly enjoyed this movie. Like I said, the humor is on point. It hits more than it misses, and when it hits, this movie has a lot of really clever, really funny moments. So the humor definitely hits, and the animation of this movie is so gorgeous. It is such a beautiful movie to look at. Even if you put this movie on mute, you would still be able to appreciate the stylistic animation of this movie. It's just really cool. And once again, the action is very fast-paced, which is exactly what you want in an animated action movie. You can do that. So when there is action happening, it's very fast-paced and really hits. So the action is very good. And this movie is just overall a very solid movie. Yes, it's my least favorite of this trilogy, but it's not really saying that much because I still thoroughly enjoyed it anyways. What I'm getting at is Kung Fu Panda 3 is still very much worth your time, even if the hearing that is my least favorite of the three, it doesn't really mean all that much. It's still a movie I would highly recommend to anybody who loves animation. So in the end, I'd call Kung Fu Panda 3 solid. So, that's it. Have you guys seen Kung Fu Panda 3? Have you seen the other two? Which is your personal favorite? To me, after rewatching these, I actually think that the second one is my favorite, mostly just because of that villain. I really like that villain. But I want to know, what is your favorite of this trilogy? Yeah, so leave your comments below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. That really helps me out a lot. And, yeah, so stay frosty.